Thank you all for being here. This is the fourth in our series for the Chancellor's third annual Mental Health and Wellness series. I'm grateful to the Chancellor, Francine Conway, if those of you don't know, is also a psychologist and has really prioritized mental health and wellness at Rutgers. And this is a series that she does every year. And our Center for Youth Social Emotional Wellness is collaborating with her this year. And today I'm going to talk about ADHD, and tomorrow we'll end the series with anxiety. All of these seminars are designed to be really skills and strategies focused, and we've emphasized to presenters really to minimize background information and to quickly get into skills and strategies. We hope that's helpful to you. My name is Josh Langberg. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm a professor of psychology in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. I direct the Center for Youth Social Emotional Wellness, and I also serve as the inaugural Chief Wellness Officer for Rutgers University, New Brunswick, which is a pleasure that many universities don't have, but again, as part of our Chancellor's vision, that's something that we have here at Rutgers. And today I'll be talking to you about my own area of expertise, which is ADHD. I have two disclosures to make. They are related to books that I've published. Some of the skills and strategies that I will talk about today come from those books, although the whole point of my talk is that many interventions that we do for ADHD are very similar and based upon behavioral, cognitive behavioral principles. And these books are just one of many that are based upon those principles. But I receive royalties from these books. Consistent with all of our presentations, I'm really only going to spend one or two slides on background. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page regarding how I'm thinking about ADHD. I'm going to spend most of the talk talking about what I think are the core principles that make up effective ADHD intervention. My hope is that if you understand these core principles, you can then take them and apply them to change any behavior you're working with, whether you're a parent working with a child or a clinician working with a client or a teacher. They really should be applicable across the board, and regardless of the behavior you're concerned with. What I'm going to try to do is provide examples of how you would take these principles and apply them to different things. I'm going to give you an example around homework and organization, and I'm going to end with an example around behavior. I have lots of resources for you today. I have checklists that you can just take and use. I hope you find those helpful. It's difficult for me to see the chat while I'm screen sharing. So what I'm going to do is go through this talk, and then when I end, I'm going to put a bunch of things in the chat for you, namely these checklists that I hope you'll be able to use in your homes and in your practices. And so just very briefly, I'm going to be saying attention deficit hyperactivity disorder today. And I don't want anyone in the audience to say this doesn't apply to me. What about ADD? And I'm just using the language that the current diagnostic manual uses, which calls everything ADHD. Why? I don't really know, but that's what it does. And so that's the language I'm using today. And if you're thinking, oh, ADD is what's relevant to me, that would be ADHD inattentive presentation. These are the three presentations that we currently use for diagnosis. They used to be called types or subtypes, and now they're presentations because we realize that they're not necessarily stable across time. For example, if you're diagnosed with combined presentation as a child, often you transition to inattentive presentation as an adolescent or adult. Just to give you an idea, these are the symptoms of inattention, the 9 symptoms of inattention, they're summarized here. And one thing, the reason I put them up is because often we think about ADHD as difficulties with distractibility and inattention, and that's certainly true. But a lot of the symptoms that have to do with ADHD really do focus on this key, what I think is a key functional construct of organization. Difficulty organizing, losing things, forgetful, fail to finish tasks. And that's why in one of my examples of applying the principles, I'm going to focus on how you might apply the principles for organization. These are the symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity. Again, we have 9. you'll see that impulsivity is only represented with three symptoms. Some people actually would argue that they would like impulsivity to be more strongly represented. And my last background slide, just so that we're all on the same page, is what does it mean, or how is ADHD diagnosed? And we could have a whole presentation on this. But what a provider is looking for when they're making a diagnosis of ADHD is, remember I showed you that list, for example, of 9 symptoms or 9 behaviors. That's a domain, the inattention domain. And so we're looking for 6 or more of those symptoms or behaviors within a domain. But it's not as simple as it sounds, because everybody is inattentive at times. Everybody struggles with concentration, particularly when you're under a lot of stress, you're going to struggle with concentration. Maybe if you're having difficulty sleeping. So we really have to figure out whether these are different, they're developmentally inappropriate, and they're occurring often or very often in someone's life. We also have to make sure that symptoms have been present prior to age 12. That used to be prior to age 7. The point here is that ADHD is something that is present in childhood and persistent across time. And if you find yourself as an adult struggling with inattention for the first time, or restlessness, most likely that's not ADHD. That's one of the many other things that can cause someone to be inattentive or restless. And we're going to try to figure that out when we work with you. Another reason diagnosing ADHD can be complex is because many other mental health conditions, such as depression and anxiety, can lead someone to be inattentive or feeling restless, and we have to parse that out. So that's enough of the background. I thought I would start today with a question, and that question is, why do people engage in hard or adversive tasks when there are easier and more fun options in the moment? And maybe that seems obvious to you, but I really do think that it's core to understanding neurodiversity and core to understanding ADHD. Many of you experienced this when you thought about whether or not you would join this webinar today. Um, there's a little over 200 people in the webinar. I think we probably had about, for all these talks, closer to 400 or 500 registered. So where did that number change? Where did we go from people who thought that signing up for a webinar was important for their life and their long-term goals versus actually logging on? And there's lots of reasons for that. Certainly things could have come up in your life, but the point I'm trying to make here is that for many people in the moment, there are things that are more immediately rewarding, that feel better, that don't involve sitting in front of your screen for yet another hour. And these are the types of decisions that individuals, regardless of ADHD or not, are faced with every day. And to say that another way, um, many of us do the things we do. We engage in hard or adversive tasks because of our long-term goals. I put some up here, right, that we might think about. I want to get good grades. I want to save money for travel. I want to get into medical school. I'd like to get a raise. I want my children to have a better life. And we're thinking about these things and we're weighing these things. And then in the moment, it helps drive our behavior towards these long-term goals and rewards. It helps us inhibit from doing what we would probably want to be doing, which is probably not being on a seminar like this and perhaps doing something more pleasurable. But we have to acknowledge that in the environment, there are many immediately available rewards for behaviors that are not conducive to our long-term goals. And when we think about youth, the biggest one is always going to be attention, especially from peers. So I like to think about this as a scale. And a neurodiversity means, to me, at least for ADHD, that each of us, each of our brains approach and weigh these decisions, these long-term versus short-term, differently. So some of you in the room are going to be really geared towards long-term goals. You're always focused on your long-term goals. That's probably where I fall. And in our society, we tend to reward people who are really focused and driven by long-term goals. There are negatives to that, though, and it's important to acknowledge that from a neurodiversity perspective. Um, I've been married for 23 years. It's taken me a long time to be more spontaneous and in the moment with my spouse and to be able to engage in things and fun and spur of the moment because that's not how necessarily I'm wired. There's a pro to that and there's a con to that. For other people, they are wired to live in the moment and be more spontaneous, and they're probably a lot more fun than I am. But it can be really hard for them in the moment to inhibit behaviors and to do things that will help them lead towards their long-term goals. So I view this as a scale, and every person falls differently on that scale. So several theories propose that difficulties with executive function underlie symptoms of ADHD. So I just talked about inhibiting your behavior in the moment and not going for what's most immediately rewarding for you, such as attention, or such as doing something pleasurable, so that you can work towards your long-term goals. In executive function terms, that would be called behavioral disinhibition, or you might think of it as a difficulty self-regulating your behavior in a moment to inhibit and say, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to work towards long-term goals. This is relevant because the literature would say that for individuals with ADHD, these immediately available rewards in our environment are much more salient than the long-term rewards. They're very powerful and they're unlikely to be able to inhibit their behavior to go for those immediately available rewards. So some examples of that might be, I get asked a lot, why can someone with ADHD play video games for hours? How is that possible? They're showing that they have the ability to attend. Video games are essentially the most immediately rewarding task that you could design for someone. You press a button, points come up, something happens on the screen. We're providing rapid, immediate, salient rewards for engaging in a task. And someone with ADHD is going to do pretty well with that. If my scale is balanced towards immediately available rewards versus long-term rewards, what might I do? What might I look like? Well, perhaps I might call out answers in a classroom setting. Perhaps I might seek attention from peers, even if that attention is not necessarily positive attention. Perhaps I would run out of the classroom and not record my homework because I want to get out in the hall and talk to my friends. Perhaps I would procrastinate with studying because there's a whole list of things I'd rather do than studying. Perhaps I might leave my room messy. So here I'm describing many behaviors that we associate with ADHD, but I'm putting them in a different context. I'm putting them in a context of someone whose scale is tipped towards having immediately available rewards, be very salient. And in the moment, those long-term rewards are not salient at all. Unfortunately, what that means is it creates lots of difficulty and impairment, if you want to use a DSM term, because in school and work, if you're an adult, we largely define and reward success by the successful pursuit of long-term goals. We do very little with them in the immediate term, in terms of rewarding positive behavior. So let's just think about a typical school setting. How do we define success in school as parents or as teachers? We think about success as your grades largely, right? On your tests and your projects and your report cards. These are the main metrics. And someone might go a long period without receiving much feedback until they get a test or a project back. In the school setting, we ask people to sit still for long periods. We ask them to not call out or chat with their peers. Why? Why would they do that? Those are the most immediately available reinforcing things for them. Well, we might say, it's the right thing to do. We want you to have a good reputation with your teachers. We want you to learn. And the case that I'm making for you here today is that for someone with ADHD, as much as we want that, that is not salient in the moment. It's not that they don't know that. It's not that they don't also hold that goal or that value. But in the moment, the immediately available reward is always going to win. And so as parents or clinicians, we have to think about how do we balance that scale. You can even think about it in your own life, in your own work. How often is it that you get positive reinforcement on a regular basis for the behaviors that you're demonstrating? Probably not very often. Sometimes you might have a great supervisor or a boss who does that. But oftentimes we're going along and we're trying to self-motivate ourselves so that at the end of the year, the end of the quarter, someone reviews us and perhaps we get a pay bump. Again, society is really leaning towards reinforcing those who are able to go inhibit their behavior and go for long-term goals. So the question is, if we're parents or teachers or clinicians, and someone's scale is tipped towards immediately available rewards that are already out there in the environment, how do we combat this? And that's where behavioral intervention principles come in. And these are the principles I believe that you can apply to any behavior. And today I'll give you a bunch of checklists that show my attempts to do so. So balancing the scale to me essentially means making compelling rewards. And I have that in quotes because rewards can be kind of a controversial topic. But by that, I might mean just someone getting positive feedback or attention, for example, is a reward. Making compelling rewards available in the environment for engaging in positive behaviors in the immediate term that are aligned with our long-term goals. And the only way that we can do that is if we start by specifically defining the behavior that we want to see, which is probably the core behavioral principle. It sounds easy, and most of the checklists that I'm going to put in the chat today are my attempts to do that. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because defining a behavior in the positive, defining organization, defining planning, defining attention is actually quite hard, so that we can come to an agreement on what that definition is and that you can track and monitor that definition. So a lot of work actually goes into that as a parent or a clinician or a teacher. But it's only when we have that definition and agree on that definition in the positive that we can provide a youth with consistent and frequent monitoring of that behavior and monitoring and giving them feedback about that behavior. Russell Barkley is a famous ADHD researcher and clinician, coined the term point of performance. And by that, he's saying, if we specifically define what we want to see, we can then create a situation where we can provide immediately available feedback close to the behavior as possible, close to the point of performance of that behavior for engaging in that behavior. It also allows us to set realistic short-term goals because now we have data, and it allows us to reward progress. And I'm going to try to demonstrate today that these principles can be applied to any behavior, but I want to acknowledge up front that the main challenge with these principles is feasibility. Consistently and frequently monitoring any behavior for a very busy parent or teacher is difficult at best. And so I think that that's our role, frankly, for those of you who are clinicians in the room, is coming up with systems that are going to be effective, but are also feasible. Because if they're feasible, they'll be inconsistent and they won't work. And there's a real tension there when we think about behavioral principles. So if we define what we want to see in the positive, it means that we're not waiting for failure. Think about a typical school setting. When do parents hear from teachers? They hear from teachers when something has gone wrong. And so we want to create a system where they can hear from teachers when things are going well on a regular and consistent basis. It also reduces arguments. For example, I tell the story somewhat frequently that growing up, my dad used to send me upstairs to study. And he would say, when I come back down from studying, if I've studied, I can go outside and I can do what I wanted to do outside. So I would go upstairs and then I would come back down and say, see you later outside. And he would say, well, wait a minute, let me ask you some questions. And inevitably, I would not know the amount of questions that he thought was appropriate for someone who went upstairs and studying. We didn't specifically define what we wanted to see. So for example, it might be, I want you to go upstairs and make 20 flashcards. And when you come back down, if you know 10 of them, you can go outside. I've specifically defined what I want to see in the positive so that we can agree on it. And I'm going to give you a bunch more examples like that today. It also helps us set realistic goals. And one thing that's important if you're working with someone with ADHD as a parent or a teacher or a clinician is to know that they're probably anticipating that whatever you're asking of them, they're not going to be able to do. And unfortunately, that's because they've had a series of people who have asked them to do things, tried different programs, tried different interventions, and then told them that they weren't doing it very well. Most likely because the targets were set too high and the goals weren't realistic. And so what that creates is someone who's coming to work with us who doesn't believe they can be successful. And the only way we can combat that is by immediately showing them that this time will be different. We want to almost guarantee success on any goal we set. And that gets them to believe that they can trust us. That gets buy-in, we sometimes call that, because they really have to reverse years of learning about how these interventions will work. If you're working with an adolescent and helping them to be organized, you're probably the 20th person in a line of people who've tried to help them be organized, and they believe this is going to be like all those other times. So we want to set realistic and easy to achieve goals. And then we want to monitor and reward as frequently as possible. The more frequent and close to the point of behavior, the more effective our intervention will be, again, with the acknowledgement that that is difficult. But hopefully some of these checklists will help you with that. So I'm just going to jump into a bunch of examples after this slide. But if you've ever worked with someone or you're currently working with a child or adolescent or even adult, and you've tried different behavior plans, here are some questions you might ask yourself to help you adjust your system. Is the behavior I'm trying to change clearly defined and in the positive? If not, try to tighten up that definition. Are we monitoring and giving the student or youth or adult feedback as frequently and consistent as possible? If you're giving feedback once a week, that seems perhaps like a lot from a feasibility standpoint, but for someone with ADHD, that's too long term. That will not overcome the power of immediately available rewards. Is the student receiving feedback from the monitoring? If we just complete our checklist but don't actually talk to the student about it and encourage them and praise them, that doesn't help them be motivated. Are the goals realistic and achievable? Or did I set something, did I say, well, you've been getting all C's, but if you get an A, then well, I've already lost that battle. They don't believe they can be successful, and so they're not going to engage in my system. And then we can have a whole talk about consequences. I'm not advocating for not consequences. In fact, I think consequences are equally important. But when we set up clear systems like this, a consequence is already built into the system because it's the absence of the reward. It's the absence of the praise or attention that we're giving for the positive behaviors that we've defined. So let's go through some examples of how we might apply these principles. We'll start with homework recording or planning, said another way. This is actually a wonderful opportunity, I think, to teach adolescents, even people as young as fifth grade, skills that they're going to be required to use as adults, whether they pursue a work environment or whether they pursue college, which is breaking things down into small steps and completing those steps over time in order to achieve a long-term goal. We often, in school settings, assume that students know how to do this. We don't necessarily explicitly teach how you plan out something. How do you use a planner to consider doing 3, 4, 5 steps so that you get the grade you want on a test or that you turn in the project on time? And so one thing we often do when we work with students with ADHD is that we encourage them to record all of their homework and studying in one place, in a physical planner or an online planner, acknowledging that these days many teachers post things online. But even though they post them online, it's likely 3 or 4 separate websites. And when you do it that way, it's very hard to see things all together. It's very hard to see your entire week and the tasks that you have. So we often ask students to record all of their things for the week in a planner, just like an adult might do with their appointments. I'm going to zoom in on this and I'm going to give you this checklist. This is a checklist I created. I call it the time management checklist. It's probably better planning, but I'm going to give you some examples. What am I trying to do here? I'm trying to specifically define what I want to see in the positive so that I can monitor it consistently and frequently. There are those principles again. We tell people to plan all the time. What does that mean? Plan ahead. Don't procrastinate. When they procrastinate, we tell them they shouldn't have procrastinated. Unless we define what we want to see, we cannot give that immediate and frequent feedback. So here's a definition. Student recorded an upcoming test or quiz in a planner at least one day in advance of that test or quiz in general terms. They wrote test today. So here's this big planner that I've had the student working in, and I see they wrote test today. Many parents would be thrilled if they saw that, and that's good enough, and that's fine. But we can think about how we would shape that behavior. Well, we might want them to actually list the pages that test's going to cover. So we can put that there. And we can assign a point value to that if we want to use points. How about for test and quiz studying? How might we define things in the positive? Well, in this big planner that we have in front of us that the student's using, they might actually give themselves a little homework assignment. They might actually show that they're thinking ahead and planning for when they want to study. Student designated a time to study for an upcoming test at least one day in advance of the test. They wrote study for test today. But we want to shape behavior gradually, and that allows us to do realistic goals over time. So we can get more specific than that. Maybe number 2 there has them record the amount of time they want to study. Number 3, a student is actually saying to you as the clinician or as the parent how they're going to study. Outline chapter 4 and make flashcards. And you can see how we're getting progressively more complex with our skills. But again, I just want to highlight that all I'm doing here is specifically defining what I want to do in the positive, rather than doing what we typically do as parents and in schools, which is waiting for someone to fail and then telling them they shouldn't have done that. And then I'm using this checklist to give them as frequent feedback as possible. So I could use this checklist every day after school if I'm a parent. I could use this checklist once a week if I'm a clinician, and even that is way more frequent positive feedback about these behaviors. And probably it's the first time in their life they've had these behaviors defined for them. So I hope that's useful. You can do this for yourself as an adult. This doesn't have to be for youth. There's a lot of adults that I've worked with who set up their own checklists and self-monitor. They basically say that they're going to go through their checklist. For example, if they're working on something with their finances or they're working on something with organization, and they set up 2 times a week and they complete those checklists 2 times a week for themselves, and they set up a little reward for themselves, such as watching their favorite show after they complete their checklist. So this doesn't have to be something that's unique to youth. When I do these types of exercises with youth, I often find it's helpful if I'm running a class or an after-school program to actually have a discussion about why we recorded certain things in our planners. Because again, we often assume that people know how to do these skills, that we know what it means to plan ahead. And if you have a discussion with a bunch of students in a room, you'll find that they all think about planning and studying and how much and what methods they use very differently, and it can be beneficial just to have those conversations. With all of these interventions, you would want a system of checking or monitoring, meaning using this checklist as frequent as possible at the beginning. And then over time, you're going to reduce the frequency, and that puts the onus back on the individual you're working with and helps promote self-management. So, for example, if I completed a checklist twice a week, at first, maybe I would switch one of those times a week and ask the individual I was working with to complete the checklist themselves, getting them in the habit of self-management. Now I'm going to switch and give an example of organization and materials, and then I'll switch and give examples of how we might apply that to just more typical behavior. So for organization and materials, the principle is the same. Um, what's one of the most common battles that parents have with kids? Well, there's many, but one of them is someone is told to organize their room or to clean their room, and they come downstairs and they say they clean their room and they go outside, and someone goes upstairs and they find that everything in the room was shoved under the bed. And that, again, is, in my opinion, simply a lost opportunity that we didn't specifically define what we wanted to see for organization. We had different definitions, and therefore, in the outcome, we ended up having an argument or a disagreement. The same can be said for room, the same can be said for school organization. We assume that students know what it means to be organized, be it their physical materials or these days their online materials. When I first started doing this work, everything was physical, paper and pencil. People were using book bags. Now we live in an age where it's actually more complex because some teachers are using physical materials and paper and pencil, and others are completely online. And as a parent, that can be very difficult to help your child organize in both places. And so what I had to do was go back and think about, what does it mean to be organized online on your computer? And that was actually very difficult for me. And many people in our Zoom room here could probably do a better job than I do. But I would ask you to think about, how do you do that? How do you organize things in folders? How do you label documents? How often do you go and take the 30 things you've saved to your desktop and try to move them somewhere? And this is what it means to be organized. And we don't necessarily define or tell people we want this type of behavior, but we have an opportunity to do that. So here's some example criteria. No loose papers in the book bag, no files saved to the desktop, online documents include a date at the end. These are just examples of how I might specifically define organization. Typically with something like organization, we could do the same for the room, right? We could say all of your clothes are folded and put away in your drawers, and the bed is made. Monitoring, you probably don't need to do organization as frequently as you do something like planning, because there's just not as many instances of that behavior. Once per week is typically sufficient. Let me see if I have a zoom in. Yes. Again, I'm going to give you this checklist, so you don't need to write this down. But this is my attempt. If a student was carrying a physical binder, what does it look like to have an organized physical binder? If a student's carrying a book bag, what does it look like to have an organized book bag? If a student is use everything online, what does it look like to have online or organized computer files? And I want to be clear that I don't think that my definitions are necessarily the best definitions. You as a parent or a teacher or a clinician can probably come up with better definitions. And ideally, you would do that with the youth that you're working with so that you can jointly collaborate to agree on what this looks like. But the key is starting off and specifically defining in the positive what you want to see. Because that then, again, to go back to our principles, I can put a date on top of this, and in probably 3 seconds, or well, 3 seconds per criteria, I can sit with that kid and I can say yes, yes, no, no, or no, no, yes, yes. And now I have frequent and consistent monitoring of behavior defined in the positive, and I can set a short-term realistic goal. What do I mean by that? I can say tomorrow I'd like to see you have a 1 out of a 3. And if you have a 1 out of a 3, then X. I couldn't do that before because I was just waiting for failure and I didn't have anything specifically defined in the positive. When I'm working with someone on organization, um, I also typically have them put a little plan in place for when they're going to organize their materials. It's challenging for all of us, frankly. Again, I would use I would, if you're someone who never saves anything to your desktop, then you're better than I am. Um, but that's just as an example. I personally have to have some time each week when I really sit down with my computer and say, okay, I've been working too fast. I need to make sure I'm organized. That's my plan. So I might say, at the end of the week, before I check out on Friday, I'm going to clean things up on my computer. Well, if I'm working with the youth, they need something like that too. Meaning a teacher teaches up to the bell and they have to run out of class and go somewhere else. Well, it's probably not realistic that they put everything exactly where it needs to be in the moment because they need to get to that next class. And so that can be stressful for them. So helping them think through when each week would they like to clean their things up and be organized so that when they come to see you as the parent or the clinician, they earn those points. They get those yeses. Remember, we want people to succeed. If they're failing, that's probably on us. We probably set a goal that was too hard. I would much rather have a plan with a student that says, hey, you're coming to see me on Monday. So maybe you make a little note and you put it on the back of your door and it says organize book bag and binder and computer on Sunday. That way we almost guarantee that when you come to me, you're going to have all yeses. That's what I mean by a plan, helping them really think through when they're going to do this. I mentioned that you can transition to self-management over time. It's just a very simple something any of you could make on your own computer, make it look a lot prettier than this. But this is an example of a checklist I used with a kid for self-management of organization. This was someone who had more physical materials at their school. And so again, I might, as a parent, say, I'd like you to do this checklist on your own every Sunday, kind of to get ready for your week. And if you show me this checklist, then X, Y, or Z. I'll do the checklist with you on Wednesday. Another example of just a very basic parent checklist. I showed you the organization checklist, and it had lots of criteria on it. If I'm a clinician, I might do something like that. But again, if I'm a parent, that's not feasible. It takes too much time. And so I'm really thinking about 3 or 4 key behaviors if I'm doing self-management or parent management. Any more than that is kind of overwhelming. I've talked a lot about rewards, and we could have a whole nother series that focuses on rewards. And I've tried to emphasize that what I mean by that mostly is by giving positive attention, calling out that you see the behavior, being proud of the person or proud of yourself for that behavior. That's what I mean by a reward. But sometimes people like to do more formal rewards, and they will say that each yes counts as a point, and then they can very easily translate that into a reward menu if you so choose. Rewards don't have to cost money. We can be creative so that they don't cost money. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if I hadn't specifically defined what I want to see in the positive, and if I wasn't monitoring it, there would be no way to tie points or anything to it. But now that I've done that, if I so choose to have an official reward system, it really lends itself to that. And I can say something is worth 10 points, something is worth 50 points. And ideally, I would come to these with the youth I was working with. So as we work towards wrapping up, I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes for questions, and I'm going to put everything in the chat. We're going to finish by talking about applications to behavior. Many of you have heard about daily report cards. There's tons of research on daily report cards. And what I want to point out is that all daily report cards are the principles that we've talked about here today. That's all they are. In fact, many of the interventions that you see out there for ADHD are just repackaging of these principles in different ways, at least in my opinion. And that's what I want, the message I want to get across today, because you can do these things yourself. Essentially, daily report cards are designed to counter the typical school environment that we talked about, or you can have a home daily report card where adolescents or youth receive very infrequent feedback about their positive behavior, raising their hand, not talking to a peer, making eye contact, turning in something on time. And instead, they only receive feedback when the behavior is problematic. And a daily report card is designed to counter that. The more detailed or specific the behavioral target, the better, just like with organization and just like with planning. So I give an example here. I can set a goal for a child to go from participating 0 times in class to participating in class 2 times, and it's clear what needs to be accomplished. So, for example, I could have a little checklist, and it could say John participated in class, and it could say number of times in my period, and I could send that home to the parent. That would be a very simple example of a daily report card. And I'll give you several daily report cards so that you can see what I'm talking about. Sometimes we see daily report cards come home from school that aren't that specific, though. And that's where we, as parents or teachers or clinicians, can help people put more effective systems in place. So, for example, you might see smiley or sad faces, but there's no real behavioral anchors on there. It's just John's behavior and then smiley or sad. I can't set any goals around that. I don't really, at least I can't shape behavior. I can't gradually set a realistic goal with that. So, because what might unfortunately happen, for example, is that a child is great for 3/4 of the day and then kind of loses it and pushes someone or yells at their peer and they get a sad face. And what I don't know as a parent is that actually that was one of the best days they've had all month. And they end up getting a consequence for what in their mind was a good day. And that's really problematic because kids learn the wrong message. And so when we're not very specific, it can lead to actually more problems for us. But again, we have to consider feasibility. And a daily report card where you're counting something is not going to be feasible for many teachers. And by the way, my wife is a fifth grade teacher, and so anybody who is on here as a teacher has my thanks and gratitude in this environment that we live in. It is one of the more difficult jobs. So we might say, well, we don't want smiley or sad faces, but we're going to rate a behavior like your attention or whatever that might be on a 0 to 10. And 0 is bad and 10 is good. That's better than a smiley or sad face. It gives me a little bit more room. I can say, oh, you got a 6 yesterday and you got a 7 today. I can kind of set more realistic goals. So that's nice. But I'm still worried that we're not on the same page for what that definition is. And so if I'm going to use a 0 to 10 scale on a daily report home to a parent, I'd love to have some anchors on there. This is what I mean by a 0, and this is what I mean by a 10. And as a teacher, I'm not necessarily counting every single one of those behaviors to a T, but I'm getting a general sense of where I think that child fell. And at least the parent can know, oh, they got a 10, which means they probably blurted out near 5 times today, or they got a 0. So I'm putting anchors there. And again, what I said earlier in the talk is whether you're a parent or a teacher or a clinician, any of these interventions are a trade-off between effectiveness, which is always going to be the most frequent and consistent monitoring and specific we can be, and feasibility, which is everybody's life is different. We wax and wane in how much stress that we're under and how much time we have and patience we have. And these systems have to be adjusted to account for people's life circumstances. Otherwise, as a clinician, you find someone sitting in front of you and they're nodding and saying, yeah, yeah, this sounds good, but they're not going to be able to do it. And we need to put things in place that people can do. I put a few more just comments about daily report cards here. It can be very difficult to word things in the positive. It's something I struggle with too when it comes to behavior. So I just put a few examples to get you thinking. John completes morning work within the designated time. John participates in math class at least X times. John stays in designated area during story time. John took notes for at least X% of expected time during a lecture. So that might be for like an adolescent. Um, the other thing you have to consider with daily report cards is what chunk of the day you're going to monitor. It's not feasible, for example, in elementary school to ask a teacher to monitor all day. That we're going to carry around a clipboard when they've got 30 other kids and monitor for 8 hours. That's not happening. So you have to think about what chunk of the day perhaps is most difficult. Maybe that's transition time tends to be difficult for people with ADHD. And can we monitor only for short periods of time to increase that feasibility for teachers? Sometimes you just can't come up with positive behaviors. And as much as you'd like to, you have to list some negative behaviors on there. And that's okay too. Um, because blurting out or interfering with your peers, these are things that are pretty obvious. And sometimes DRCs um, need those things. Number of times called out, number of times got out of seat. I see those all the time. That's not a problem. If you have those, I'd rather that than the parent get no feedback. You will get these slides for this entire series. We're going to post every single video and all of the slides. But if you want to screenshot this now, like you're welcome to. What I've tried to give you here is resources that will literally walk you through how to establish a daily report card and give you lots of examples. And lastly, if the system isn't working, this is you can use family. And so if you're struggling with your kid and or you can use it if you're a clinician, the first thing I think about is feasibility. Have I put a system in place that is manageable for me and the child I'm working with? Or have I overwhelmed myself and now I just feel like I'm failing at the system? Have I set achievable goals? Have I almost guaranteed success? Am I making this fun? If I feel like every time I monitor, it's negative, something's wrong. We should be, for the most part, saying, wow, you did it. Great job, because I'm wording things in the positive. If it doesn't feel like that to you, we need to start with a lower bar and find things that we can get buy-in and excitement around. Letting go, what does that mean? It means that we all wish that our children would excel in all areas at once, and we try to give them feedback about all those areas at once. And what we do is we overwhelm them and we overwhelm ourselves. We have to pick one or two things to work on at a time and let the others go, and that can be really hard. And you is if something's not being effective, a lot of times we as parents, we might be part of the problem, and part of our stress is getting in the way of having an effective system, and we need to be honest about that and get the help we need so that we can be effective with our children. So with that, I'm going to attempt to take questions and put lots of documents in the chat all at one time. Thank you. If you have a question, can you please send it in the chat to either me or Jessica, because we have so many people on this that I don't think I'll be able to look at hands and things like that. Oh, yes. Someone asked the question which comes up all the time and is totally a fair question, which is how do teachers implement this over a wide number of students? And everybody's going to fall differently on this. There's no right answer for this. I would suggest, though, that if you're in a classroom, you think about the ability to define positive behaviors and not actually physically monitor them, but to think about them becoming things that you call out on a regular basis rather than waiting for kids to fail. It can become part of your natural way of teaching. I used to run a lot of after school programs. So if someone does something and I say, wow, that was a great job raising your hand. I really appreciate how you raised your hand. Let me answer your question. Or someone taps their peer and they're trying to pass them a note. And I say, wow, John, that was awesome. I noticed how you didn't take that note and you really tried to ignore. That's hard to do. Thank you. What am I doing? Or somebody, I dismiss for recess and one person is sitting there and they're actually putting their papers away. And I say, wow, Sarah, you're putting all your papers away instead of running out for recess. That's awesome. The other kids are hearing me say that. And I am giving positive and specific reinforcement in the moment. And that can be a less time intensive way. Because I totally admit that that actually monitoring is for an individual is more difficult. And that's probably going to be the kids in your classroom who have a 504 or an IEP that you're going to do something like that for. The slides will be sent around to everybody who was registered. Psych testing for ADHD. Yes. So our our society kind of has different levels of that we need just to have the bandwidth, because ADHD is such a prevalent condition, anywhere from 7 to 10%, depending on which numbers you look at or believe, that it's not possible for psychologists, for example, to do all of these things. So pediatricians or primary care docs have become the front line and for the most part do a pretty good job on assessing and diagnosing ADHD. But ADHD having comorbid, what we would call comorbid or other difficulties like anxiety or depression or a learning disability is actually the rule rather than the exception. And so if you have a child where you're thinking that that ADHD is fine, but you're worried about other things like anxiety or depression or a learning disability, or even though you're getting treated for ADHD, you're still struggling. That's when I think seeing a psychologist for more comprehensive testing is warranted, and that's the way I would think about that. Oh my goodness. Um, there's a question from my chancellor. I did not know my boss was on this call. I would have been a lot more nervous if I had known that, because my chancellor, the all of Rutgers New Brunswick chancellor, Dr. Conway, is an expert in ADHD herself. So I am super glad that she kept that quiet until now. Um, but she talks about how do we manage the lack of motivation, which is something that Dr. Conway has a lot of expertise in. Um, I get that question all the time, though. Why is my child not internally motivated? And when I get that question, I sometimes turn it back to the person who's asking me, and I ask them, why would we expect them to be internally motivated? Where does internal motivation come from? In my opinion, internal motivation comes from going through life and feeling like you're being successful and getting that feedback so that you want to continue to be driven to work towards your long-term goals. If you're someone who goes through life and feels like no matter what you do, people are telling you that it's not going well and that you're not living up to expectations, why would you be motivated? What would you be motivated for? And so, to me, someone with ADHD who's had that life experience, not being motivated or not to being internally motivated, is actually what I would expect. And that's why ensuring that the first time I work with them is a restart. And I show them that this is different and that the goal I set they are going to achieve, and I'm going to be excited about it, is so important. It gains that buy-in and trust and begins what is a long journey towards getting someone to believe that they can be successful and be motivated on their own. Yes, I'm gonna send all of the PDFs, and given time, I may end up just attaching them in a big email for you all. These are amazing questions. Someone asked about ODD, which we would say is oppositional defiant disorder. A lot of these interventions and principles are the same. In fact, a lot of the principles that we now apply to ADHD started off in more of the ODD world, and it's important to acknowledge that. So if you have someone um, who is not just having difficulty getting attention, but they're kind of being actively defiant, the way I think about that is that while ADHD is something that is heritable and learned, ADHD is something that's heritable and biological. Excuse me. ODD is something that is a pattern behavior that becomes learned over time, often because you are not getting positive attention and you are experiencing a lot of perceived failures. And if you're someone who lives that way, not trying and refusing to engage with adults actually feels a lot better than trying again and failing. Not trying, being argumentative on purpose, which is how we define ODD, means that I'm in control. I am choosing how I interact with you in the world. And although that seems counterintuitive, that feels better than repeatedly trying and being told you're failing. So I believe these same principles apply for someone who has um, ADHD. I'm trying to do so many things at once here. Let's see. Medication management is um, happy to do a talk on that. Absolutely, medication is a personal choice that you should be made as a parent or with a clinician. There are certain behaviors that are pretty easy to address with the behavioral principles I told you today. If someone is extremely inattentive, meaning they're really only on task for a minute or two before they go off task, that's the level of severity. Medication can be very important for someone like that. Why? Because it's almost impossible to be as frequent, as consistent as we need to be with behavioral principles for someone who gets off task that quickly. So that's kind of how I think about it. Yes, so this will be the last question. Someone asked about gender or biological sex. We ADHD is diagnosed 3 to 1, boys to girls. Some people would say that that should be closer to 2 to 3 or even 3 to 3, and that girls are more likely to be what we would consider ADHD inattentive type. And if you're in a classroom with 20 or 30 students and you're not acting out and you're not getting out of your seat, you're less likely to be noticed if you're just distractible and inattentive. And so it doesn't change the strategies. The strategies would be the same, but for being female, it may mean you're less likely to be diagnosed and receive the appropriate services that you need. I appreciate all the positive feedback and questions. If you look me up, Joshua Langberg, my email is available at Rutgers. I welcome questions. I welcome collaborations. I really appreciate you being here today. I promise that I will send you the video, the slides, and all of the checklists. I just couldn't manage everything at once on my screen, but every person who is here today will receive all that. Please feel free to email me, and I look forward to following up with you. Take care.